Welcome to Season 3, Episode 3 of CSS Breakdown, book by book. Each episode this season corresponds to a chapter from Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society. And today, in Chapter 3, we explore how cultures around the world weave their own distinct versions of gender, challenging the idea that gender roles are rooted in biology.
Exactly. We're looking at how what we think of as fixed might not be so fixed after all.
You send us some incredibly thought-provoking sources, and what stands out immediately is this powerful idea that what we often take for granted as fixed or natural when it comes to gender is anything but. This deep dive is really about taking a step outside our own cultural assumptions, our own bubble, and seeing the astonishing variety in how humanity has chosen to define masculinity and femininity throughout history and across the globe.
Yeah, it's like that quote you mentioned from Harriet Martineau back in 1837. A true test of civilization is understanding the condition of that half of society over which the other half has power. It sets the stage perfectly.
It really does.
So we're diving deep into anthropological research that directly challenges the idea that biological sex is destiny, that it unilaterally determines gender roles, behavior, and social structures.
Because if biology was the sole driver, we'd expect to see similar patterns everywhere, wouldn't we?
Precisely. The classic biological deterministic view assumes physiological differences lead to behavioral differences, which lead to social structures.
And inequality just gets baked in somehow.
Right, like it's encoded in our bodies.
Hmm.
Variations, by this logic, could only really be explained by, biological anomalies. But the sources you've provided lay out compelling evidence that makes you serially question that assumption.
Okay, so we're going to unpack fascinating case studies, different theories on why gender inequality exists and how it varies. Some truly surprising customs, maybe.
Oh, definitely surprising. And even look at how societies define not just two genders, but sometimes 3, 4, or more.
Right. Get ready for some perspective shifts, maybe some aha moments that might make you look at gender in a completely new way.
Our mission in this deep dive is to extract the most important nuggets from your sources, the compelling evidence, the contrasting viewpoints, the striking details. It's all about helping you understand the profound role of culture in shaping gender.
And what that means for challenging those assumptions about biology. Let's unpack this.
Okay, so let's start by really scrutinizing that biological deterministic view. It's such a dominant idea, especially in Western culture. Biological sex is gender, and it dictates everything from how we behave to the roles we play and even why there's inequality.
Yeah, that assumption that any variation must just be a biological quirk or anomaly.
Exactly. But then, almost immediately, the sources present counter-evidence that throws a wrench in that whole idea.
Like what? What's the first big challenge?
Right away, you see examples that challenge that rigidity. Take the case of Dominican pseudohermaphrodites mentioned in the sources.
Okay.
These are individuals born with ambiguous genitalia who, in this specific cultural context, were often raised initially as girls. But then, around puberty, hormonal changes cause their bodies to masculinize.
Right, I remember reading about that.
And the crucial finding is that when these individuals, having been raised as girls, then transition to living as men, they successfully integrated into male social roles in their community.
And what does that tell us? I mean, the implication seems huge.
It suggests a remarkable flexibility, right? In what's considered possible for gender identity and social role adoption that simply isn't accounted for if biology is the rigid sole determinant.
Because if your biology at birth strictly fixed your gender identity and potential roles.
Exactly. That kind of transition, beyond just the physical changes, shouldn't be something people can successfully do and be accepted within a community.
Exactly. And the sources don't stop there, do they?
Not at all. They point to the sheer dramatic differences in how masculinity and femininity are defined across different cultures. If biology was setting a fixed template for temperament or behavior, how do you explain that variation? You have populations with very similar biological characteristics, yet what counts as masculine or feminine behavior, personality traits, or social roles can be worlds apart from one culture to the next.
That global diversity is hard to reconcile with a simple biological explanation. It just doesn't line up.
It really doesn't. And it's not just the differences in definitions either, but the differences in the degree of inequality.
Ah, right. The sources highlight the vast variations in gender inequality across societies. Some cultures show much wider gaps in power and status between men and women than others.
Yeah. Again, if inequality was just encoded into our physiology, you'd expect a more uniform level of inequality wherever biology is similar. The fact that it varies so much points strongly to non-biological factors being at play, social factors, cultural factors.
What's fascinating here, too, is the discussion about potential biases within the biological models themselves. It's not just that they might be wrong. The sources suggest they might have been built on culturally specific assumptions from the start.
Mm-hmm. Anthropologists, for instance, argued that early Western observers projected their own cultural values about gender roles onto the cultures they were studying.
They saw what they expected to see, basically.
Pretty much. And the sources point out how early evolutionists, like Stephen Goldberg, might have overlooked or downplayed the roles of women or failed to account for the ways colonialism impacted traditional gender differences when forming their theories.
Yes, this is a critical point the sources emphasize, drawing from anthropologists like Karen Brodkin. Biological researchers often assume that gender difference naturally implied gender inequality.
Right. We see difference, and our Western minds tend to create hierarchies, valuing one over the other.
But Brodkin's argument, supported by anthropological evidence, is that it's often the other way around that gender inequality can actually create or amplify gender difference.
Wait, inequality creates difference? That feels like it flips everything I thought on its head. How does that work?
Think about it this way. If one group holds power over another, they might emphasize or even invent distinctions, differences in capabilities, temperaments, or appropriate roles as a way to justify that power imbalance.
Ah, okay, so it becomes an ideology.
Exactly, an ideology that supports the existing hierarchy. So instead of biology creating difference, and that difference leading to one sex dominating, the dominance relationship itself can shape what those perceived differences look like, or make minor biological variations seem vastly more significant than they are.
It solidifies power by making the unequal roles seem natural. Got it.
That's a powerful idea. The notion that social power dynamics aren't just shaped by perceived differences, but can actively produce those differences ideologically. It really underlines why looking beyond biology is essential.
And that leads us right into the heart of anthropological responses to this, particularly the groundbreaking work of Margaret Mead.
Right, Mead. Her work in Samoa, New Guinea. Places like that.
Yes, her research was directly aimed at challenging those casual biological assumptions. She was very clear. Sex differences, meaning the social roles and temperaments associated with sex, are not something deeply biological.
So she argued they're learned.
Learned behaviors and attitudes, yes. That societies then rationalize and solidify as natural. And if anyone deviates from these culturally defined norms, societies often explain it away by blaming biological flaws, like a glandular defect or something similar.
Her most famous work on this is Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies from 1935. What was she trying to show with those specific examples?
Her explicit goal was to show Americans that the way we defined masculinity and femininity in the U.S. was just one cultural possibility among many.
Gotta hold up a mirror.
Exactly. By demonstrating the enormous cultural variation possible, she hoped we'd see our own gender roles as culturally constructed and therefore changeable, not fixed by some universal biology.
And those three societies she studied in New Guinea paint such a vivid picture of this variation. Let's start with the Arapesh. What were they like?
Mead described the Arapesh as a culture where both men and women were expected to be gentle, passive, and emotionally warm. Both were considered equally happy, trustful, confident.
So not much difference between the sexes in terms of temperament.
Very little. Individualism wasn't really prized. Crucially, child-rearing was a shared task. Mead described both men and women as maternal, and neither boys nor girls were pushed towards aggression.
And their relationships.
Their sexual relationships were described as relatively equal, focused more on companionship than passion. Mead even called their political arrangements utopian, and their life was marked by quiet and uneventful cooperation.
The sources include those beautiful descriptions. Singing in the cold dawn, men who sit happily playing, women holding suckling children. It sounds idyllic, almost.
It paints a picture of a soft, gentle culture where those traits were applied to everyone, regardless of sex.
Okay, gentle cooperation for everyone. Now, the complete opposite, the Mundugamor. They were headhunters and cannibals. That sounds different.
Radically different. And here, both men and women were expected to be equally aggressive and violent.
So, similar in temperament again, but in the opposite direction.
Exactly. Mundugamor women, unlike the Arapesh or many Western ideals, weren't particularly maternal. They disliked pregnancy and nursing and were eager to get back to work or war.
The source includes that image of babies carried in harsh, opaque baskets that scratch their skins. That says a lot.
It does. There was intense father-son rivalry, even leading to male infanticide, and a pervasive fear of being wronged. They were wealthy, partly because of their population control methods, which involved this violence.
Mead's summary captures it. Violent, competitive, aggressively sexual, jealous, ready to see and avenge insult, delighting in display and action in fighting.
So you have the gentle Arapesh, where both sexes are similar, and the aggressive Mundugumor, where both sexes are also similar, but in a completely different, opposite way.
That right there is powerful evidence against a fixed biological template for temperament.
Absolutely. And then the Chambuli add the third piece of the puzzle. Here, like in the US, women and men were seen as extremely different.
But the pattern was reversed.
Completely reversed from Western norms.
This is the one where the men were the focus of nurturing and adornment, right? They were the ones described as charming, graceful, coquettish, dressing up with curls and jewelry, focused on shopping and consumption.
Yes, exactly. While the women were the dominant, energetic economic providers doing the fishing and controlling commerce and diplomacy, they were unadorned, efficient, and businesslike.
Mead noted that little girls of 10 and 11 were more alertly intelligent and more enterprising than little boys.
And the men worried about what the women will think, what the women will say, what the women will do, while the women were a solid group. Brisk, patronizing, and jovial.
It completely flips our common sense ideas about what is natural for men and women. Just turns it on its head.
Exactly. So Mead showed us two cultures with minimal gender difference, Arapesh and Mundugumor in different ways, and one with extreme difference, Shambuli, but a pattern opposite to the U.S.
And crucially, she noted that all three of these cultures, just like the U.S., believed their specific definitions of masculinity and femininity were simply due to biology.
Yes, they had rationalized their cultural practices and expectations as innate biology, just like we often do.
Mead's powerful conclusion was that human nature is astonishingly malleable. We are capable of being molded to a single pattern, like the Arapesh or Mundugumor, just as easily as to a complex, different pattern, like the Chambuli or the U.S.
She demonstrated the possibility of widely different gender configurations shaped by culture. What her work didn't fully address, though, was why different cultures developed such different patterns.
Or why, despite this potential for variation, some form of male domination is still so widespread across societies.
Right. Those questions really set the stage for subsequent anthropological research, trying to figure out the causes of these patterns.
Which brings us to another key theme the sources highlight: the centrality of the gender division of labor. Almost universally, societies divide tasks and roles by gender and age. If it's not purely biology dictating who does what, how did this pattern emerge and persist?
Well, one major perspective is the functionalist view. This suggests that in early societies, particularly hunting and gathering ones, a sex-based division of labor was necessary for survival.
Practical reasons, basically.
Kind of. Different kinds of labor were needed, and perhaps perceived biological differences, strength for hunting, reproductive roles for gathering childcare, made a division functional. Functionalists debate whether one sex's work was valued more, but they tend to see this historical necessity as making the division somewhat ingrained or not something to be easily changed.
So the idea is it might have started based on some practical differences, and then it just became the norm, the tradition.
That's the functionalist argument. But the counter-argument emphasized in your sources is that because this division has a history, it's not some timeless, biologically inevitable fact.
Right, societies change.
Exactly. And the division of labor has changed dramatically over time. As anthropologist Adrienne Zillman notes, the sexual division of labor, as we know it today, probably developed quite recently in human evolution. It's not some ancient fixed blueprint.
And the sources point out the incredible variation in what tasks are assigned to men or women across cultures.
It's huge. In some places, women build houses. In others, men do. Who cooks or fishes or farms varies widely. While childcare is often associated with women, it's rarely exclusively their responsibility, and in some cultures, men are quite involved.
And the rigidity varies too, right? Some cultures are super strict about it, others more flexible.
Precisely. This variability strongly suggests that while a division of labor might be common, the specific content of that division is culturally determined, not physically dictated.
And crucially, the sources argue that for modern, complex societies, a strict sex-based division of labor is largely functionally anachronistic.
Yeah, the biological bases that might have seemed relevant are far less so now. Physical strength isn't the currency of male power today. The source contrasts a bodybuilder with a suburban husband doing chores. Power resides in other forms of capital and organization.
And technology has dramatically changed the game, particularly for women. Things like birth control, legal abortion, institutional childcare.
They've freed women from being solely defined by their reproductive role or confined to the domestic sphere. Women are entering virtually every field.
The sources challenge us to think about occupations today that are strictly limited by biology. And the list is incredibly short.
Like what? Wet nurse, surrogate mother for women?
Professional sperm donor for men.
Yeah.
And as the source notes, none of these are exactly common career paths.
Right. It really makes you pause.
It does. If the physical differences are less determinative and technology has eroded many historical constraints, why does a gender division of labor, and particularly one leading to male dominance, persist?
If it's outlived its functional usefulness or physical imperative, the sources argue its persistence must be maintained by something else, the power of one sex over the other.
So that brings us back to power.
Exactly. This leads us to the big question. Where does that power come from? What are the structural forces that explain the division of labor and the near universality of male domination, even if in variable forms?
And the sources point to several theories about this, looking at things like private property, warfare, and male bonding.
Let's start with the idea that private property was a key driver, famously linked to Friedrich Engels, who applied Karl Marx's ideas in The Origins of the Family, private property, and the state.
Right, Engels connected the rise of capitalist economy, the nation-state, and the nuclear family to the development of private property.
He contrasted this with earlier pre-capitalist families, which he argued were more communal, maybe with group marriage, where men and women were relatively equal, and the division of labor didn't create political or moral hierarchies based on sex.
The pivotal change for Engels was the emergence of capitalism and its mobile, transferable wealth, private property.
Which needed to be passed down through inheritance, requiring clear lines of descent.
And to ensure the inheritance went to one's biological son, men needed to be certain of paternity.
Which led to the demand for female sexual fidelity and the development of monogamous marriage, but often, notably, monogamy for the woman, not necessarily the man.
And that required male control over women's sexuality and reproductive capacity to ensure that paternity, locking women into a domestic role tied to inheritance.
And for that inheritance system to be stable and protected, it needed clear, binding laws enforced by a centralized political power, the nation-state. So for Engels, the rise of private property was the engine that created the nuclear family structure, centered on male control and the state apparatus to uphold it.
And the sources note that some contemporary anthropologists find support for this. Eleanor Leacock, for instance.
Right. Leacock argued that in societies prior to private property and class divisions, women and men were autonomous individuals with distinct but complementary roles that were equally esteemed. She's quoted saying their status wasn't as literal equals, but as what they were, female persons with their own rights, duties, and responsibilities, which were complementary to and in no way secondary to those of men.
Leacock's study of the Montagnais Escapi on the Labrador Peninsula provides a powerful ethnographic example. She showed how the introduction of the fur trade and a commercial economy dramatically transformed women's roles,
reducing them from relatively autonomous participants in subsistence to being dependent on men involved in the market. This economic shift, she argued, directly brought gender inequality and widened the gap in what it meant to be masculine or feminine.
Karen Sachs, or Karen Brodkin, also examined this in 4 African cultures. She found that the more involved these tribes became in the market economy, the more egalitarian roles shifted towards male dominance.
Higher market involvement correlated with greater gender inequality and lower women's status, while shared access to productive resources was linked to sexual egalitarianism. The material organization of society clearly shapes gender power dynamics. It's not just ideas, it's economics.
Okay, so that's the private property argument. What about warfare?
Another major theory points to the imperatives of primitive warfare as the origin of male domination. Anthropologist Marvin Harris suggested that societies needing fierce warriors had to find a way to reward them and create solidarity among the fighting men without causing internal conflict.
How would they do that?
His argument is that one effective way was to reward virtually all men with access to or control over women, excluding perhaps only the weakest or most inadequate men.
Wow. So women become a kind of reward for male solidarity.
That's the theory. It links practices like female infanticide, which keeps the female population lower, increasing male competition for the remaining women, and excluding women from fighting, which reduces male motivation to protect women and upholds the sexual hierarchy.
So in this view, warfare drives female subordination and patrilinearity, because you need that core of fathers and sons for military tasks.
Right. Men control resources and use ideology, like patriarchal religion, to justify their dominance.
Then you have the descent theorists like Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox. They focus more on biology, didn't they?
Sort of. They focus on the biological bond between mother and child as fundamental. They argue men lack this direct link to the next generation. How do they connect to society and ensure their lineage?
By bonding with other men.
Exactly. By forming strong bonds with other men in hunting or fighting groups. They argued this was a reason women were excluded from certain male activities like hunting. The need for men to connect socially led to male solidarity and eventually monogamy as a way to organize social life around these male bonds.
And alliance theorists like Claude Levi-Strauss also focused on relationships among men as central to social organization.
Right. In this view, women become objects of exchange between men marrying off daughters or sisters to cement alliances between male kinship groups. It's about the bonds between men structuring society.
It's worth noting, as the sources do, that while these theories highlight important dynamics, they've been criticized for sometimes treating male bonding or the exchange of women as invariant biological or natural outcomes.
Yeah, rather than recognizing that these are also historical and culturally variable relationships shaped by specific social contexts, it's not always the same everywhere.
Okay, so we have these potential origins for male domination in property, warfare, or bonding. But, as you mentioned earlier, the degree of male domination varies astoundingly. So even if there's a tendency towards it, it's not a uniform experience.
Exactly. It's near universal, but manifests with tremendous variety.
Which brings us to the question of what determines women's status in different societies. What factors raise it or lower it?
Precisely. Status can be much more pronounced or much less so. The sources emphasize it's not a simple scale where more difference automatically means more inequality, though often they correlate. Anthropological research points to several key variables that interact: economic, political, social, creating different configurations for women's status.
Like what? What are some key factors?
One factor is the degree to which a society relies on physical strength and specific motor skills. Cultures where these are highly necessary tend to show larger differences in how males and females are socialized and the roles they are assigned.
Makes sense. What else?
The size of the family group seems to matter too. Larger extended family groups often correlate with greater gender difference, partly because in more isolated nuclear families, there's simply more need for flexibility. People have to do whatever tasks are required, regardless of traditional gender roles.
Okay, practicality kicks in again.
And a absolutely crucial determinant is the division of labor around childcare. Women's reproductive role has historically been a constraint on their participation in other spheres. The sources state very clearly, the more men participate in childcare and the freer women are from being solely responsible for it, the higher women's status tends to be.
That seems really key. How do societies manage that?
Well, different ways. Employing child nurses, sharing care with husbands or neighbors, or having older post-childbearing women or even tribal elders take on significant caregiving roles. Anything that shares the burden.
The relationships between children and parents are also key, apparently. Sociologist Scott Coltrane's finding is particularly interesting here.
Yeah, that closer father-son relationship actually correlates with higher women's status.
That seems counterintuitive again. Why would a strong bond between father and son improve women's status?
The explanation Coltrane offers is that in cultures where fathers are largely absent or uninvolved in child rearing, boys tend to define their masculinity in opposition to their mothers and other women.
Ah, okay. Leading to hypermasculinity.
Possibly. A need to constantly prove they are not like women, which often involves fearing, denigrating, or controlling women. When fathers share child rearing and are closer to their children, boys don't need to define themselves as much against their mothers.
Margaret Mead made a similar point, didn't she? That men must learn to be nurturers.
Yes, she said, every known human society rests firmly on the learned, nurturing behavior of men. This learned behavior, being variable, impacts gender equality.
And the link to gender inequality is clear. The more time men spend with children, the less gender inequality tends to exist. And conversely, the more women are freed from the full-time burden of childcare.
The higher their status, it works both ways.
Another significant factor Coltrane identified is women's control over property after marriage.
Yes, status is consistently higher when a woman retains control over her own economic resources. Economic autonomy matters.
And this brings us back to something we touched on: spatial segregation. Daphne Spain's work mapping cultures found that societies with the most elaborate sex-segregated rituals and spaces, like men's huts, tend to have the lowest women's status.
Right, Spain's mapping showed a correlation. The further the men's hut was from the village center, the more time men spent there, and the more culturally important the rituals performed there were, the lower women's status. Her conclusion: societies with men's huts are those in which women have the least power,
Because the men are just separate.
less involved.
Exactly. If men are spending most of their time away from the home and family in these segregated spaces, they are less involved in family life, including child rearing, which we've seen is key to women's status.
Anthropologist Thomas Breger also found this link. All forms of spatial segregation between sexes are associated with gender inequality.
And the Mayanaku in central Brazil provide a really stark, disturbing example mentioned in the source. They have highly institutionalized men's huts, and women are strictly prohibited from entering. The source includes that truly chilling quote from a Mahinaku man to Gregor about what happens if a woman enters.
This house is only for men. Women may not see anything in here. If a woman comes in, then all the men take her into the woods and she's raped. Presented neutrally, this quote starkly illustrates the extreme control men exert and the direct link between enforced spatial segregation and the very low status of women in that society, where they can be treated as property to be violated.
And tragically, these factors determining women's status are also linked to violence against women. Lower women's status in a society correlates with a higher likelihood of rape and other forms of violence.
Peggy Reeves-Sanday's comparative study reinforces these points. She found that sex segregation was highly associated with lower women's status, suggesting it's almost necessary for the development of sexual inequality and male dominance.
While egalitarian societies lacked that segregation ideology.
Right. Women's economic power was also a critical determinant. And she also found that in cultures that viewed the environment as relatively friendly, women's status was higher. Hostile environments seemed linked to more male domination.
And finally, Sanday found that equality was highest and rape least frequent, when both men and women contributed roughly equally to the food supply.
In these societies, men were also more involved in childcare. Interestingly, women's status was lower when they contributed either very little or a great deal to the food supply, compared to when their contributions were more balanced. Maybe too much dependence either way.
So we can summarize the key findings from cross-cultural research on female status and male dominance based on these sources. First, male dominance is lower when men and women work together with little sexual division of labor.
And sex segregation of work is actually the strongest predictor of women's status.
Second, male dominance is more pronounced when men control the political and ideological resources needed for cultural goals and when they control all forms of property.
Third, male dominance is exacerbated under colonialism, as capitalist penetration and industrialization often decrease women's status. It's also linked to demographic imbalances, specifically a higher ratio of marriageable men to women.
And fourth, environmental stresses seem to exaggerate existing male domination. These points provide a clear picture of the social, economic, and spatial mechanisms that shape women's status and the degree of inequality, separate from simple biology.
This brings us to a difficult but necessary topic that really highlights the cultural construction of gender inequality and power: cross-cultural explanations of rape.
Right. Our sources directly challenge those evolutionary psychological explanations that portray rape as simply an evolutionary reproductive strategy for less successful males.
The ethnographic evidence overwhelmingly points to rape being a fundamentally cultural phenomenon. It's not, as the source bluntly puts it, an alternative dating strategy.
So how does it function culturally?
In ways like cementing relations between men, acting as a strategy to ensure continued male domination, or even, in some interpretations, as a vehicle for men to symbolically conceal maternal dependence.
The examples are stark and disturbing. Consider the use of rape in warfare. Mass rapes in conflicts like Bosnia or Sudan.
They're not random acts by frustrated individuals. The source describes them as systematic efforts by militarized males to express and sustain the subordination of the conquered group of males.
It's framed as the ultimate humiliating appropriation of the conquered group's property, including their women. Like saying, we burn your houses, eat your chickens, and rape your women. We have fully and completely conquered you.
It's a performance of power over the men of the other group, using their women as the symbolic battleground. Chilling.
And the case of Mukhtar Mai in Pakistan in 2002, mentioned in the sources, is another horrific example. She was gang raped by order of a local judicial council as punishment for her brother's supposed crime.
This was a blatant act of reproducing male domination. a demonstration of the council's power over her brother, using her, and a reassertion of the broader hierarchy of men over women. It was a judicially sanctioned act of control and terror, clearly having nothing to do with evolutionary reproductive strategy.
Peggy Reeves' Sanday's study of a campus gang rape at the University of Pennsylvania draws a striking parallel to this kind of judicially sanctioned violence.
She suggests such acts have roots not in reproductive drive, but in the gender inequality that allows men to see women as objects and in men's need to demonstrate masculinity to each other.
So in this analysis, gang rape cements relations among men.
That's the argument. Sanday even suggests a potential homoerotic component, the pleasure derived from feeling friend's semen inside the woman, turning her into a shared receptacle that allows men to engage in same-sex activity while still claiming heterosexuality. The powerful conclusion from this section is that such behavior is only truly possible in cultures that deeply degrade and devalue women. Rape is not an evolutionary impulse. It happens in societies steeped in gender inequality, perpetrated by men who often are successful in other areas but feel entitled to commit violence.
This strongly reinforces the point we discussed earlier. It's about gender, the cultural and social meanings and power dynamics tied to sex, not just biological drives.
And in these cases, gender inequality produces gender difference, creating a social world where women can be treated as property or symbols in men's power struggles.
Let's shift gears to something else that reveals how deeply gender is culturally constructed: rituals. Examining rituals like the division of labor or gender definitions shows that their origins are non-biological, and they often reflect core cultural ideas about gender roles and power.
Yeah, it makes sense that many rituals focus on reproduction and child-rearing, given their centrality to gender inequality. And spatial segregation, which we've seen as linked to low women's status, also often involves ritual segregation.
Male initiation rituals are very common, particularly circumcision. The sources discuss the prevalence of circumcision, the removal of the foreskin, and how the age it's performed varies widely across cultures.
Right. Different theories exist about its origins and purpose. In the Jewish Bible, it's a visible sign of the covenant with God. Historically, it may have originated as a trophy taken by warriors from conquered foes.
Like the biblical story of David needing foreskins to marry Saul's daughter.
Exactly. Another theory suggests it creates a permanent scar that binds men together, providing a shared identity and group membership. It's also seen as a symbolic rite of passage, severing a boy's emotional ties to his mother to ensure he identifies fully with the masculine world.
And there's a significant correlation noted in the sources. Cultures that emphasize the circumcision of young males tend to be those with the greatest gender differentiation and inequality.
Because it's almost always a public ceremony that cements bonds between father and son, links males together, and crucially, is a ritual that visibly and demonstrably excludes women. Thus, it's often strongly associated with male domination.
The sources also mention other forms of male genital mutilation found in fewer cultures, like ritual bleeding of the penis.
In cultures that see women as impure, yeah. Or hemicastration in a few cultures, sometimes linked to beliefs about preventing twins.
While a medical justification for male circumcision was historically debated, reduced infection risk, the source states this is no longer supported by evidence. Infection and cancer rates are similar regardless today.
The U.S. has the highest rate among advanced industrial societies, though it has dropped. The source points out the striking lack of widespread campaigns against male circumcision compared to those against female circumcision.
Which brings us to female circumcision, or female genital mutilation, FGM.
Yeah.
Practiced in fewer cultures, but deeply tied to controlling women's sexuality and medically harmful.
Absolutely. The sources describe different forms: clitoridectomy, removing the clitoris, and fibulation, sewing the labia shut, leaving a small opening. It's often performed by older women or, in some cases, the girl's father's brother.
Location matters too, right? Clitoridectomy widespread in Africa, infibulation more concentrated in East Africa.
And the explicit goals are focused on controlling female sexuality. Infibulation is meant to prevent sexual intercourse, and clitoridectomy is meant to prevent sexual pleasure and thus promiscuity.
The WHO estimates are staggering 130 million girls and women have undergone some form of cutting. The source includes a disturbing first-hand account from a Sudanese woman detailing the trauma.
It's horrific. And the sources highlight that cultures with both male and female circumcision tend to exhibit the highest degree of male dominance.
And the purpose is fundamentally different.
Completely. While male circumcision often functions to mark cultural identity and reinforce male bonds and difference from women, female circumcision has no medical basis, actively impedes sexual function, and is explicitly designed to curtail female sexual pleasure.
The timing is significant too. Female circumcision is almost always performed at puberty, just as girls become capable of experiencing sexual pleasure.
Linking the ritual directly to men's control over women's sexuality.
There's a complex debate around campaigns against FGM, human rights violation versus cultural defense.
Yes, advocates rightly condemn it, while some defenders argue it's deeply rooted culturally, sometimes claiming women are revered afterward. The source notes the asymmetry. Widespread international condemnation of FGM, but almost none against male circumcision.
The sources do mention hopeful examples, like the Cutting Through Words movement in Kenya, where women are developing alternative coming-of-age rituals using education and advocacy without mutilation.
Which shows change is possible, though, as Priscilla Nangarai is quoted, changing such deep cultural practices requires careful work.
The sources also present the materialist interpretation of rituals offered by Jeffrey and Karen Page, linking ritual origins to a culture's relationship with its material environment.
Right, not just abstract beliefs. They look at rituals like Kuvaid, where men observe various taboos during their lives, pregnancy and postpartum, often seen as sympathy.
But Page and Page see it differently.
They argue its significance lies in cultures lacking legal means to keep couples together or assure paternity. Kuvaid becomes a ritualized way for men to publicly and symbolically claim paternity.
And thereby exert a form of control over women's sexuality by asserting control over the outcome paternity.
Exactly. They also examine purba, the Islamic requirement for women's concealment. Ostensibly, this is to protect women's chastity and men's honor, justified by the idea that women are so sexy, so tempting, so incapable of controlling their emotions and sexuality that they are a danger to the social order.
So men control social order by controlling women's sexuality through concealment.
But, as the source points out, there's a flip side. It implies that men themselves are highly susceptible, incapable of resisting temptation, easy prey. It suggests a need to control women not just to protect society from women, but to protect men from their own perceived inability to resist.
It's a powerful way to look at rituals, seeing them not just as symbolic actions, but as mechanisms tied to material conditions, power dynamics, and the control of reproduction and sexuality.
And speaking of cultural contrasts, the source offers a great counterexample to Western norms about who adorns themselves for whom the would-a-baby people.
Right, where the men dress up and parade for the women.
Exactly. The men spend hours adorning themselves elaborately, and the women act as judges, choosing partners based on traits like height, white teeth, and white eyes, seen as signs of health. This directly contradicts the Western idea that women are the primary adorners and men the selectors.
This really pushes us to question our assumptions about what gender looks like and how it functions. And that leads us to a question that perhaps most directly challenges the Western, biologically deterministic view. How many genders are there?
We typically assume two genders based on two biological sexes, but some cultures recognize more. It's fascinating.
Native American cultures offer some of the most compelling examples.
Okay.
The Navajo, for instance, traditionally recognized three genders: masculine men, feminine women, and the natal.
The natal were individuals whose sex might be ambiguous at birth or who might choose this identity later. They performed tasks of both genders and dressed accordingly. They were typically treated as women and addressed with feminine kinship terms.
And crucially, the sources point out that being treated as a woman in traditional Navajo society was actually a promotion, not a demotion.
Because Navajo women historically held higher status than men, with significant rights and privileges. Sexual freedom, property control, dispute mediation. Natals were free to marry either males or females without losing status.
The source references that photo of Squaw Jim, a male-bodied crow birdache, showing his distinctive status even dressed as a woman.
Yes, that concept is related to the birdache, a term for individuals in some Native American and other cultures who are members of one biological sex but adopt the gender identity of the other, more commonly males adopting female roles.
Walter Williams' study, The Spirit and the Flesh, explored this. Men who dressed, worked, acted as women, but were known biologically as male.
Yeah. Among the Crow, for example, some were males who simply chose not to be warriors. The source references figures showing Mux individuals in southern Mexico, illustrating community acceptance.
The sources contrast this sharply with the often harsh treatment of males who express cross-gender identities in the U.S., seen as freaks, deviants, maybe homosexual outcasts.
The source states starkly, Acting like a burdick in this culture is not recommended if you value your health and your life.
Yet, among some Great Plains Native American cultures, bird aches were highly revered, seen as having special powers, holding high status, often controlling ritual life.
And the logic given was interesting. By being men living like women, they were seen as sexually indifferent to women, unlike other men, possessed of supernatural power to resist female charms. Only the burdache could administer fairly without seeking a specific woman.
The source references Sabine Lang's chart, showing the wide range of activities and roles associated with the male-bodied burdache, underlining the cultural complexity.
Female burdaches were less common, but the source mentions a case among the Nahun where a family might choose one daughter to live as a man, treated as a boy from age 5.
The Mojave of North America recognized 4 genders and had specific institutionalized roles. The Aloha were biological males adopting female roles.
Undergoing initiation, adopting a female name, marrying a man, even simulating menstruation and childbirth with culturally accepted explanations.
And the Huam were biological females living men's lives, hunting, farming, assuming paternal responsibility, though excluded from political leadership.
And neither the Aliha nor the Huam were considered deviant in Mojave society, accepted parts of the culture.
And another fascinating example from the Middle East is the Omani Xanath. Biological males, female social identity.
Skilled domestic servants dress in men's tunics but pastel colors, passive homosexual relationships. Distinct social roles, they can speak with women on the street, sit with women at events, unlike other men.
What's truly striking about the Xanath, as the source notes, is the fluidity. They can change identity, be seen as males, engage in heterosexual sex, become social men as they age.
Some become women and marry men, others move back and forth. This fluidity is presented as something unthinkable within a strictly biological deterministic framework.
These studies of gender fluidity lead us naturally into the anthropological explorations of sexual diversity. Taken together, they provide compelling evidence for the cultural construction of both gender and sexuality.
Challenging the idea that sexual behavior is solely driven by biological reproduction or that specific practices are inherently natural.
Take homosexuality. Evolutionary biology might struggle to explain it as a non-reproductive aberration.
But the counter-argument is that it's incredibly common in the animal kingdom and ubiquitous in human cultures, so common it seems quite natural. The variation isn't in its presence, but in how it's treated and understood.
The source mentions Cluckon's 1948 survey finding homosexuality accepted by 120 out of the 174 North American Indian tribes. Some cultures allowed homosexual marriages and had defined roles.
This is distinct from ritualized homosexuality, like the Sambia in Papua New Guinea, studied by Gilbert Hurt. Here, ritualized same-sex activity is central to initiating boys into adult manhood.
Right. The boys fell at older boys to receive semen, seen as a vital life fluid necessary for growth.
Yes. As one elder is quoted, if a boy doesn't eat semen, he remains small and weak. Later, these boys become the ones who are fellated by younger boys. During this phase, they avoid girls, have no knowledge of heterosexuality until marriage, no adult homosexuality among the Sambia.
They see it as necessary for becoming reluctant warriors.
A way to receive the life force needed for manhood. A similar practice is found among the Karaki in Melanesia, where boys are sodomized by older men, believing semen is necessary for growth. It also stops at puberty. A Karaki man reportedly said, "Why, yes, otherwise how should I have grown?"
These ritual practices are often linked to gender inequality, right? More common in cultures with high sex segregation and low women's status.
Yes. The elaborate male bonding rituals exclude women, correlating with lower women's status. The source draws that comparison to U.S. gay hustlers who maintain masculinity by being the inserter, suggesting the Sambia practice seems less alien when viewed through cultural definitions of roles, not fixed orientation.
Some cultures show remarkable permissiveness or specific patterns. The Aranda, Siwans, Karaki practiced adolescent homosexuality and adult bisexuality.
Sometimes as a way to divert adolescent sex from young girls, preventing teenage pregnancies, controlling birth rates. The Yanomamo institutionalized male homosexuality alongside female infanticide may be linked to warrior culture fears of population growth.
The Etero and Marind Anam in New Guinea actually prefer homosexuality but maintain heterosexual marriages for reproduction.
Yeah, the Etero have taboos on heterosexual sex most of the year. The Marind Anam avoid opposite-sex contacts so much they raid other cultures for babies to raise as homosexual Marind Anam. That's extreme cultural shaping.
And William Davenport's study of East Bay in Melanesia describes full adult bisexuality as the norm, with most males having extensive homosexual contact throughout life while also being heterosexual and married. Women and men seen as having equal drive.
Beyond orientation or ritual, the sheer variety of sexual customs is staggering, implying behavior isn't solely about reproduction. Ernestine Friedel's example of two neighboring New Guinea tribes illustrates this.
One tribe saw sex negatively, feared women, had low birth rates fitting scarce resources.
The neighboring tribe enjoyed sex, worried about women's satisfaction, got along well, had higher birth rates fitting their abundant region. Sexual ideologies tied to environment.
Sex researchers expose the ethnocentrism of arguments for the naturalness of typical U.S. sexual behaviors. The critique of the American pattern, twice a week, night, bedroom, missionary, quick.
It's far from universal. Location varies outside versus indoors. Frequency and duration vary wildly, multiple times a night versus once a month for hours.
Foreplay norms, too. Kissing is common here, disgusting elsewhere. Some no foreplay, others hours of touch, oral sex included or never considered.
Kinsey found 70% of U.S. men only used missionary, 85% orgasmed two men's. Kluckhohn found missionary preferred in only 17 of 131 Native American cultures.
Initiation aggression norms differ. U.S. men initiate, women resistant. Contrast with Trobriand Islanders, women insatiable, initiative, or Tucano Cubeo, women aggressors, men give aphrodisiacs to cool them down.
And these cultures have fascinating self-justifying taboos. Bomber, day sex albino. Maasai, day sex fatal. Genchu, night sex blind. Yurok, conolingus, no salmon. Following taboos seems to reinforce beliefs.
The concluding point is powerful. The biological imperative to reproduce takes many forms, but none of these culturally constructed practices is inherently more natural than another.
All this anthropological research provides a crucial historical perspective challenging biological inevitability. It critiques the simple hunting-gathering origin story of male domination, men hunt, women gather, care for kids.
Right. Recent research counters this. Meat was a small part of diet, hunting less central. Tech breakthroughs weren't necessarily male, women's slings. Erect posture from gathering.
And the mother-infant bond, not just male bonding, was essential for survival. Females weren't passive, they were active economic technological participants.
Anthropologist Helen Fisher offers another historical view, noting similarities between contemporary U.S. life and early hunting-gathering cultures.
She argues traits we see as natural, now nuclear families, lifelong marriage, separate homework are recent, linked to agriculture and male domination.
While traits typical of millions of years of hunting-gathering, divorce, remarriage, institutional childcare, equal work resemble current trends.
Fisher suggests we might be returning to our true evolutionary origins after the agricultural rest stop where male domination became pronounced. She's quoted hoping for equality as a function of our birthright.
This brings us to the feminist anthropology debate about the universality of male domination. Most scholars, like Rosaldo and Nardi, find near-universal male domination. Nardi states, in no societies do women participate on an equal footing with men in activities accorded the highest prestige.
But an alternative school sees universality as an ethnological delusion, arguing for societies with equality or historical matriarchies. Gimbutas and Eisler argue Neolithic societies were goddess-worshipping, gender-equal partnership models.
So they present a barbarian invasion narrative, male domination, introduced by invaders with a male god and the lethal power of the blade, replacing peace with a violent dominator model.
Eisler suggests peace was only in a long-lost past. The sources express skepticism about relying solely on archaeology, selective evidence, sweeping categories.
They cite counter-evidence, like Fukuyama's point, that the contemporary world is less violent than hunter-gatherer societies, which had frequent war, high murder rates. Fukuyama, there was no age of innocence.
But the sources acknowledge credible evidence suggests a greater role for women early on, like likely matrilineality before conception understood, without fully accepting the invasion narrative.
They also provide examples of societies where women held significant power, even if not fully female-dominated. Maria Lipowski's study of the Vanatini in New Guinea.
Matrilineal, decentralized, no male domination, men's huts or cults. Both sexes cared for siblings, men did childcare, both had sexual freedom. Lipowski. Equal opportunities of access to prestige derived from success and exchange. Prestige based on doing, not sex.
And Peggy Sanday's study of the Minangkabau in Sumatra, matrilineal. Women self-confident and independent. Men hold formal office, but women rule without governing by fostering social bonds outside formal politics.
These examples powerfully underscore the conclusion. Women's status varies widely based on cultural factors. Male domination, while common, is not inevitable.
So taking a step back after this deep dive into cultures around the world, what are the key values of this kind of cross-cultural research? What has anthropology shown us?
Well, it's demonstrated, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the astonishing rich diversity in human cultural arrangements and the vastly different ways humans have defined gender and sexuality.
And the theories offer explanations for origins and suggest we can modify or abandon practices without damaging some evolutionary legacy.
Right. This links back to cultural relativism. As Eleanor Leacock is quoted, assertions of past inferiority for women should therefore be irrelevant to present and future developments. Just because something had a historical origin doesn't make it right now.
Yet, despite all this evidence of diversity, fluidity, and that male domination isn't biologically inevitable, a question still lingers. Why is it still so universal in some form?
Yeah, if it's not hardwired into our biology, how does its persistence happen?
That's the big question left hanging after looking at the global picture. If biological sex doesn't strictly determine gender roles or inequality, what are the mechanisms within specific societies beyond these broad historical origins that perpetuate these patterns day after day?
And how do our own specific cultural traditions, our social structures, our power dynamics shape our understanding and experience of gender right here today?
As the source hints, after looking around the world, the answers to why gender is the way it is for us might be a bit closer to home.
Exactly. That's where we need to look next.
Wow. Taking this deep dive into cultures around the world really flips the script on so many assumptions we carry about gender. Seeing the Arapesh, the Mandugamor, the Chambuli, or the complexity of natal and Xanic identities, you can't help but realize just how much of what we think is natural is actually woven by culture, tradition, and power dynamics.
And connecting that to specific factors like how childcare is shared, who controls property, where people spend their time, and even the meaning embedded in sexual rituals and customs. It paints a powerful picture of how gender roles and inequality are constructed, actively built by societies, rather than being some inherent biological blueprint.
Yeah, it feels like biology provides a spectrum of possibilities, maybe.
Right.
But culture seems to be the architect of the specific gender roles and power structures we inhabit.
That's a good way to put it. Culture is the architect.
Absolutely. It makes you look at our own culture today and wonder about the assumptions woven into the fabric of our society. Why are some practices seen as perfectly normal here, but would be bizarre elsewhere, and vice versa?
Mm-hmm.
And if we've seen such dramatic shifts and variations across different times and places, what does that tell us about the potential for change in our own society?
This dive into cross-cultural evidence leaves us with that crucial, provocative question. If biological sex doesn't strictly determine gender roles or inequality, what are the specific mechanisms within societies, our own included, that perpetuate these patterns?
And how do our own cultural traditions and power structures actively shape our understanding and experience of gender today? It really makes you think about the roots of our own gendered society.
A lot to think about, definitely.
A lot to think about. Thank you for bringing these sources to our deep dive. We'll pick up the thread next time as we continue exploring the gendered society.